Hello, I'm Matt Burns from the University of Missouri. And again, we're talking about systems change, the third video. Systems and organizational change. So this time we're going to talk about about the model, about the steps, and I have several recommendations that I'm going to make and some comments at the end. So steps for success. Again, I refer you to that really great article, a couple great articles about systems change, and even the best practices chapters on systems change are quite good as well. But the first step is create readiness. And I actually think this is the most important phase. Identify the problem, need, and potential solution. Now, again, I talked earlier about urgency. There has to be a sense of urgency. In fact, there's the lightning bolt theory around change, where they believe that true change can only happen external to the system. Some external force has to push on the system or create this or operate the system in order to get the change. So I would argue that it can happen from within if you're identifying some sort of need to change, and that's an urgency. And it might be an external force, an accountability issue, a change in the environment, something like that, where now you've got to make a change. So identify what the problem is and emphasize the need. Then we develop a project team, district and school. Again, make sure all stakeholders are represented. It's really important. Don't forget the parents. So in the state of Pennsylvania, when they implemented instructional support teams, and it was a model similar to response to intervention to RTI, but they actually argue it's not RTI. But I won't, for time's sake, I can't explain what it was. But it was a great approach to working with kids who had special needs and special learning needs. It was a pretty great success. I mean, I think several approaches to looking at it would argue that it was a success. But afterwards, after this was up and running, parents of children with disabilities sued because their children were previously being identified with a learning disability and getting accommodations on the ACT and SAT. Now all of a sudden they're not, and the parents were upset about that, and so they sued and won. So this entire state initiative that was run, completely organized by the state, run throughout the state, hugely successful, kind of went away pretty quickly because one reason could be because we didn't really involve the parents in the initial planning. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know, but that was the result. So we got to get a team that represents all stakeholders and then build trust within that team. I talked about that previously. Negotiate rules for collaboration, decision, and resources. Decide how we're going to make our decisions, how we're going to work, and how we're going to divvy up resources. Look at the functions of a team pyramid, the stages of development, all this previous video, and talk about how we're going to move through development as a team. So step one, create readiness. What's our problem? Is there an urgency? Let's talk to all of our staff and see if there's an urgency, and let's make that happen. And then once we create readiness, we get through initial implementation. We simply have a site-based team, a facilitator, train, and start the initiative, the initial implementation. Once it's up and running and we say that the things are going pretty well, we move into institutionalization, where the school owns it. There are threats that we deal with potential problems in the future. There's a mechanism to do that, and we're constantly evaluating it. And then it goes on to ongoing evolution. So it becomes institutionalized and evolves as the system changes. For more information on that, I refer you to the Adelman-Taylor 97. Google Adelman and Taylor. This is online, several places, lots of great information. So I want to talk specifically about school psychologists. And I know, I would argue this is true for special ed teachers as well. In order to sustain change, we have to do a couple things that we don't do. We have to learn about change. Now, I freely admit that I did my PhD in educational leadership because I finished my degree in 1999, which means I started I started my specialist earlier. I came in with a specialist. So I had 4 years of school post-specialist. So I started in 1995. In 1995, school psychology was not talking about systems change. We do now. We did quite a bit, but we weren't. And so we need to, so now that's great, but back then it was the case that we weren't talking about. So I decided to do a PhD in leadership to learn more about it. So I really encourage you to learn about change, more than what we've talked about today. Really read about change and change theory. Choose a meaningful focus when we talk about what the change is going to be. And by meaningful, I mean meaningful to people implementing it. encourage professional discussion. So you could be the one that helps get people talking about these particular issues, etc. Model collaborative work. As school psych and special ed teachers, we can't function without being collaborative. So really model what that looks like for other people. Build the capacity for shared leadership. Work with teams to have the team share its leadership and not just fall on one person. And you personally have to value a strong collective skill base. So you personally have to really value what every person brings to the team, and that as a team we can do more than any one individual person can. So again, we're going to end here 15 minutes or so with some recommendations I make and some conversations. Starting with looking at this job description. So here's a job description for school psychologists. Direct all group testing, diagnose problem cases, conduct therapy, conduct research, bring a unique point of view to the study of learning problems, and contribute to the general practice of education. Now, the thing I find interesting about this job description is it was written in 1925. Has school psychology really changed that much since 1925? And that's so interesting because there's been, 7, now arguably another futures conference in the process of having another one, where we have talked about the future of school psychology and what it's supposed to be. And yet, have we really changed that much? I think that's because we haven't really talked about how to implement change. We keep telling school psychologists, here, go do this, go change and do this now, but we never tell them how to implement the change. When I was president of the Michigan Association of School Psychologists, our state conference every year, the president picks a theme. My theme was change. Not what do we want school psychology to be, but how do we get there? And I think school psychology and arguably special ed too has low professional self-esteem. If we think of self-esteem as the difference between self-concept and ideal self, so if you have a high ideal self and a low self-concept, you have low self-esteem. But if your self-concept and ideal self align, you get high self-esteem. In fact, if you're better than your ideal self, that's fantastic, but that doesn't seem possible. And we tend to see that in psych and special ed. We keep saying, you should be here, you should be doing this, but you're actually down here. And that builds a lot of frustration. And school psychologists and special ed teachers have a high rate of burnout because we think we have, as professions, have low self-esteem. So I want to talk about how to look at change and how to implement change so you can make the role be what you want it to be. And I'm going to give an example, a couple examples here. So this is a grant. You've heard me talk about PRESS before, the Path to Reading Excellence in School Sites. I had the fortune of working at the University of Minnesota, the Minnesota Center for Reading Research. Lori Hellman and I were co-directors. And then we had the PRESS project, which was a reading intervention program written by several of us, the two I just mentioned, Jennifer McComas from Special Ed, the American Reading Corps, and the Minnesota Reading Corps, and other groups, came together and developed this project. Now, when we went to work in the schools, these are the 6 schools we started working with. I want to draw your attention to a couple things. 4 of them were K-8, one was K-5, one was K-6. Look at the percent free and reduced price lunch from, 42% to 93%. Percent white, 2% to 55%. This was an open school near the university. We had 6 very different schools. So we think about implementing change. We can't just take this program and shove it into 6 different schools. We have to make it look a little differently. And we talk about by region. This is an old data now. It's recently been updated, but hasn't been published yet. We look at by region. This is how much school psych, how many hours per week school psychs engage in particular activity, okay? And that's current, and this is preferred, how much they want to spend. So total, overall, school psychs spend 22.2 hours per week in assessment. They prefer 12.8. So that's a disconnect. Yeah, there were regional differences, which is the point of this paper, which I'm not going to talk about. These are regional differences. And then intervention, 7.6 hours, we want to spend 11.4. Consultation, 6.6, want to spend 9.0. So we spend a lot of time engaged in something we don't really want to do, and we keep doing things that we want to do. So the first thing you have to do is think about your sphere of influence. We tend to think of this as our sphere of influence. We're at the center of the universe, and everything revolves around us, right? That's the sphere of influence. But in reality, our sphere of influence is a little bit more like this. Yes, we have an influence, but the teachers, students, parents, community agencies, educational agencies, a much more strong, or at least equally strong influence on what we do as practitioners. Some of the best advice I ever got as a practitioner was when I graduated school, graduate school, my specialist, and I went to Jim Tucker, my advisor, and said, man, I've got all these great ideas and stuff I want to do. What do I do? And he said, go be an agent of local and national change. Now, that was a very frustrating response, but it took me a long time to appreciate what he was actually saying. And I went out of the world and started working with everyone, and I realized I was going to save the world, and the world didn't want to be saved. And that was really hard for me to accept. It was really hard for me to accept. And so I kind of gave up and said, forget it. You know what? I'm working with this little kid. His name was actually Stephen. I remember the kid quite well. And I said, I'm going to work with Stephen and see what happens. And I did. And I worked with him, and he made great growth, and the teachers noticed it. And the teachers sort of came to me and started talking to me, and then a couple of teachers started saying, hey, show me what you do. And the next thing I know, this whole school was kind of working with me to do the kind of thing you talk about doing today around RTI, but back then it didn't exist. You know, then all of a sudden in the same district, the neighboring school wanted to see what we were doing. And then a couple of principals started calling me. And then the principals from a couple other school districts were calling me. And then I was getting invited to present at state conferences and then national conferences. And all of a sudden I realized, oh, now I'm an agent of local and then national change. You have to recognize your sphere of influence, operate within it, and it will expand if you're doing good work. You have to be patient. Identify your sphere of influence to start with. That's where you start. And that's where you can get results. And if you're doing good things, your sphere of influence will expand. So I was a practitioner for 6 years, and I realized that I had taken my sphere of influence as far as I could. So I left and went to a university that focused mostly on training teachers and school psychologists. And I thought, that's a great way, right? Train the next generation of practitioners. And it was great. And I definitely expanded my sphere of influence beyond what I could as a practitioner. Oh, by the way, in between, I was an administrator, thinking that's how I can expand my sphere of influence, and was deeply disappointed in the amount of influence I had as an administrator. I felt I had more as a practitioner and then more as a researcher and as a trainer than I ever did as an administrator, which blew my mind. It was a really painful thing to discover. That leadership doesn't always mean you're the one with the leadership title. So then I was a trainer for a couple of years, and then I decided I'd reached as far as I could for sphere of influence. So I went to a research university, because really I would argue research is the way that you have the largest sphere of influence. I get phone calls and emails all the time from someone in other countries, other states, saying, hey, I just tried this thing and it worked really well. I read about it and thanks for showing it, etc. So you have to recognize that what your sphere of influence is. One school at a time, one team, one teacher, one kid. Schools don't want to change, even if you tell them that they have to. One of the disappointments of No Child Left Behind was the resistance to a lot of those changes, even though they were mandated. One team at a time, one teacher, one kid. I always go to schools. You hear me say this all the time. Give me your worst kid. And that's designed to sort of create a joke that make people laugh. But it is what I did. And it is what I do now. Because if it works with that kid, it'll work with any kid. And I find the teacher who's willing to help, who's willing to participate. Just one teacher, just one team. And let the sphere of influence grow. So a couple of recommendations as school psych and special ed: adopt scientific practice and abandon those that aren't. We know what works. We did Amanda Vanderheiden, Christina Boyce, myself did this a couple years ago. We looked at all the meta-analyses around academic interventions. And we wanted to see which ones have large effects and which ones have small effects for elementary age kids and for adolescents. Elementary, practices with large effect: repeated reading, using easier reading material, phonics instruction, etc. Writing, strategy instruction, peer assisted editing, etc. Math, drill techniques, practice the modeling. What doesn't work? Problem structure representation, grammar instruction, whole language. We know what they are. Do these. Don't do these. Be good consumers of research. Boy, this is a shocking thing for people to realize. There's bad news about bread. Do you know 98% of convicted felons eat bread? This is true. More than 90% of violent crimes are committed within 24 hours of eating bread. In the 18th century, when all bread was baked in the home, the average life expectancy was less than 50 years. And 50% of kids, literally 50% of kids who eat bread score below average on state tests. I'll let you think about that one for a while. All these statements are true. It doesn't mean they have any relevance. We have to be good consumers of research to critically evaluate research so that we can implement the stuff we know works and not the stuff like this, these kind of findings that we see all the time. We have to be able to identify causality. And then lastly, no assessment. When I was an intern, I was wanting to save the world, and I didn't care less about IQ tests. So I would go in, and I went in, and I would, I was trying to save every kid. And Mike Jones was my supervisor, and he was great. He sat me down and said, Matt, I love this. I love you want to do all this. This is great. But testing gets you into court, and testing will keep you out of it. And he was right. I was very bad at giving IQ. I thought I was good at giving IQ tests, but I was bad at pretty much every other kind of assessment except curriculum-based stuff. And that's going to get you into trouble. Almost every single court case in special ed, regardless of the issue, almost always gets back to how was the child identified. Lawyers know they can beat that. It's tough to prove you didn't get a free and appropriate public education. It's tough to prove your IP wasn't implemented, but they can beat the LD identification or the disability identification. Didn't identify when you should have, you picked the wrong category, etc. They know how to beat that. So you really, 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 as much as it pains me to think this and to say this, you have to be very good at the type of assessments we use for disability identification. And then lastly, know the law. This is great. I really encourage you to think about this. Know the law. Every state has a manual that talks about special ed law. Carry it around with you, read it, know it. But first of all, if you ever want to impress everyone at a meeting to get everyone to listen to you, just say the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which is just Section 504. But if you say Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, people listen. Know the law. And I mean, know the regulations as well, and be able to cite them, be able to show them, be able to talk about them and say, no, look, no, what about this? So I think you have to really recognize your sphere of influence, adopt a scientific practice, be good at consumer research, be good at testing, know the law. If those are the foundations of your practice, you have much more success in making your role what you want it to be.